All right, welcome back, class. I'm Professor G, and today what we're going to talk about is we are going to talk about the ancient Mesopotamian civilizations. Now, I say civilizations plural because the Mesopotamia particularly refers to a specific geographical region. If you want to go ahead and pull up your world map again, Mesopotamia is in modern-day Iraq and Iran. Modern-day Iraq and Iran, in between the Tigris and the Euphrates River, kind of that empties out there into the Gulf. So I put the Mesopotamian, forgot to add my S here, Mesopotamian civilizations, because this includes the Sumerian civilization, this includes the Babylonian civilization, the Assyrian civilization, several distinct groups that all originate from the same general geographical region. Even though they're distinct, however, they share a common, because they share a common geographical location, they also share a common culture. So we could talk about the Mesopotamian culture in general, same general worldview, same general idea about religion, about government, about the people's understanding of the universe. All this is sort of a shared idea that survives these different kingdoms. Okay, so again, the Fertile Crescent refers to that area in between the Tigris and the Euphrates River. The Fertile Crescent is well known. You think Middle East, and typically people think of desert, but the Fertile Crescent is a very rich agricultural region. And this is where the Neolithic Revolution first takes place in the Middle East, is in the Fertile Crescent. The domestication of plants and animals, again, beginning around 10,000 BC. By about anywhere from about 6,000 to 5,000 BC, you have the emergence of city-states. A city-state is an individually operating city. Okay, so you have several of these different cities kind of scattered throughout the Fertile Crescent. Sometimes they trade, sometimes they go to war, but they operate independently of each other. So beginning about 5,000 to 6,000 BC, you have the early city-states that emerge in the Fertile Crescent. By about 5,000 BC, these city-states start to come together and form what we call the Sumerian civilization. Now they come together for a very practical reason. As I said, the Fertile Crescent is in between the Tigris and the Euphrates River. Crop production, good crops, having a good harvest for that year depended largely upon the rivers themselves, whether or not the rivers flooded, whether or not they were able to get the water that they needed from these rivers. So these cities come together essentially over building sustainable irrigation systems, right? Irrigation systems that would bring a reliable and steady flow of water to their farmlands. So they come together beginning about 5,000 BC and form the Sumerian civilization. That these city-states no longer started to view themselves as individual places, but rather thought of themselves as a group. Now, I said before that the development of agriculture leads to an increase in population, and this is exactly what happens. Population increase leads to development of cities. Eventually, you have the development of government, and this happens across the board. For each of the ancient civilizations that we're going to look at, each of these places develop their own forms of government. But typically speaking, well, sorry, the lights went out. They'll go on and off during this video because I'm in the room by myself. There we go. So typically speaking, the first form of government that develops is the monarchy or the kingship, right? The form of government in which a region is controlled by a king. Now, us in the 20th and 21st century, we're used to thinking about nations and states, right? We live in the United States of America, so we think about ourselves as a large group. But this is not quite what we mean in the ancient world, right? So the early kingships arise out of large and powerful families. that take control of some corner of the market, whether it's trade, whether it's agriculture, whether it's banking. In some way, these families find a way to gain power in these early cities. And so when we talk about kingship, think of it, instead of thinking of it like a country, think of it like a large family. So a good analogy here is actually a current TV show that's on, if any of you are Game of Thrones fans, right? You have these powerful families that are competing with each other for control of the kingdom as a whole. This is exactly what's going on here. So the rise of kings is directly linked to the rise of these powerful families. And this is the first form of government that's developed in ancient Mesopotamia. It's also interesting the implications of this. And the rise of this is a type of government and a style of government that's going to be characteristic of most ancient civilizations. So you have these strong families that are bidding for power. But what also happens, I should add here, is that the rise of kings, the kings have to find a way to legitimate their power. They have to find a way to get the people to obey them, right? Because not everybody's going to be on board with this, obviously. Not everyone wants to suddenly give up a portion of their crops to some guy they never met before. And so there's several ways these early kings do this, and there's several sort of methods, right? The typical method is just through brute force, through power, through you're a wealthy family, you have enough money to purchase a large army, you're the one in control. If anybody disobeys you, they get the sword, okay? But another interesting thing starts to happen, and that's the connection between kingship, the connection between government in general, the connection between kingship and religion. The connection between kingship and religion. Because what happens almost immediately with Sumerian kingship is that the king is not just the political ruler, but that the king has some sort of special relationship with the gods. The king is chosen by the gods. The king was meant to rule. The king was supposed to rule. It's a divine decree. Right, this should start to sound somewhat familiar because this is the primary type of government that takes hold during the Middle Ages especially. Okay, so you have this early connection between the king and the religious institution, whatever that religious institution may be. Now the Samaritans were polytheistic. They're polytheistic meaning that they believed in different gods. And typically speaking, these early cities that I talked about that developed in the Fertile Crescent, these early cities would have their own individual gods. So each city would have a specific god that looked over that city. And the belief was that the king had some sort of special covenant, some sort of special relationship with his god. Okay, so the Samaritan civilization begins to emerge about 5000 BC. The principal form of government that's going to take place during this civilization is kingship, is monarchy. Okay, kingship is structured, of course, as you're probably familiar with the king at the top. He probably has some sort of advisory or council, typically consisting of family members or people that are loyal to his family. Right, and this is a top-down type system. So the king's at the top, and a small group of wealthy elite is directly under him, and then you kind of have everybody else, right? It's a very, the separation there between the rich and the poor is incredibly large. There's no, like we have today, a very large middle class. There's no middle class back then. Okay, so the rise of kingship. Now, the very first, maybe not the first king, but the first king to establish an empire is Sargon. He's a Samaritan king. Is Sargon, called in history Sargon the Great. He's called the Great because he conquers basically all of that geographical region of Mesopotamia that we're talking about, that area in between the Tigris and the Euphrates River. Sargon, through his very powerful military, is able to conquer Mesopotamia. This is the dates on Sargon's life there. So Sargon is the first king to build an empire. And so I talk about this connection between kings and religion because Sargon starts to take on a almost divine element to himself. There's a story, the story of Sargon, that gives a mythical / epic account of Sargon's birth and his life, his early childhood, right? That Sargon is a son of the gods, that he had his parents gave him up. His mom didn't want him, but she didn't want to kill him, so she puts him in a basket and sends him down the river, and one of the king's daughters picks him up and raises him, and Sargon quickly comes into power, and people immediately around him recognize that there's something special about him. This sounds familiar. It's probably because you're thinking of the book of Exodus in the Hebrew Bible and the story of Moses. This is the rule of Sargon establishes a moffat, a theme that is persistent throughout ancient literature, and that's the theme of divine kingship, of a divine ruler who has this sort of lowly beginning, who is given up by his parents, who's sort of neglected by his parents, but who by the will of the gods rises to power. And this is reflected in the story of Sargon, and he's the first to sort of set this theme. This also gives the idea that Sargon wasn't looking to become king. It's not out of some selfish desire, rather it's out of divine will. Okay? So Sargon is the first empire builder. He conquers Mesopotamia and he unites the Sumerian civilization under his rule. And typically speaking, how this would go is you would have a king with a powerful army. Sargon would conquer these cities, and then he would put somebody in charge of that city who was loyal to his rule. Usually a family member. Sometimes he would keep the same people in power as long as they promised to pay him on a regular basis. So the next great king that we can talk about in our very, very brief overview of Mesopotamian history, and I should note that Hammurabi, the next guy we're going to talk about, Hammurabi is not Sumerian. And Hammurabi is not Sumerian, he's Babylonian. So we're transitioning here from the Sumerian civilization to the Babylonian civilization. Again, these two civilizations take place, are located and centered out of the same region, and they share the same general idea. Okay? So Hammurabi, following in the footsteps of Sargon, is the king of the empire, but he's also seen as having divine favor. He's also seen as having divine blessing. Now, Hammurabi's interesting. The reason why we're talking about him is that Hammurabi does something unique, and that is Hammurabi establishes a law code. A law code. Now that seems kind of underwhelming for us because we live in a nation in which everybody has to abide by the same set of laws. Now, we have some minor differences between the states, right? But there are federal laws that if you break, you suffer the same sort of punishment if you committed it in one state as you would if you did another, right? If I murder somebody in Hawaii, I'm going to get the same, I've broken the same law as if I murder somebody in Georgia. Right, so we're used to this sort of national law code. But Hammurabi is the first person in history to institute a empire-wide set of rules, set of laws. And this is unique because the civilization of Hammurabi was much different than the civilization of Sargon, in that by Hammurabi's time, Mesopotamia was more diverse. You had more different groups, different tribes of people who had inhabited Mesopotamia. And typically speaking, the reason why this law code is so important in history is that, so you have Hammurabi who is ruling over all of these different Mesopotamian cities. These cities would have had their own sets of laws, their own sets of if you steal somebody's goat or somebody's sheep, this would happen, right? Each city would have a different rule and a different regulation for that, because they all came from different backgrounds, and typically speaking, they all worshiped different gods who demanded different things of them. So they all obeyed a different legal standard. And so what Hammurabi does with his code of law, known as Hammurabi's Code, is he establishes certain baseline rulings that everybody has to abide by. In Hammurabi's Code, you may have heard of this type of legal style, is known as eye for an eye. Eye for an eye. So, under Hammurabi's new code, it's called eye for an eye because if I'm in one city and I get into a drunken brawl, right? I'm at the pub, I'm having a few drinks, somebody insults my wife, they say she looks like a goat or something, and I punch them, right? And I knock out their eye or I bust their eye. I have to suffer the same consequence because I took somebody's eye. They will take mine, or their family will take mine. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. If I knock out their tooth, they knock out my tooth. Right? Very equal punitive justice. Whatever you have done to somebody else, they do to you. You steal somebody's sheep, they get one of your sheep. That sort of thing. And so, in creating this sort of equal system of justice based on punitive measures, Hammurabi kind of brings everybody together. And he writes out this law on these big obelisks that he sticks in each city. So not only is everybody held to the same standard, but everybody is aware of what that standard is. If you have a question, if somebody's done you wrong, and you're trying to figure out what sort of punishment it is, you just go and look at Hammurabi's obelisk. And you can look through and say, okay, he did this, he deserves this sort of punishment. And Hammurabi is unique in that sense in that he brings everybody under the same umbrella. Everybody is obliged to the same system of law. No matter whether you're rich or you're poor, you're held to the same standard. This is a historical breakthrough, a historical precedent that's going to have implications throughout history because it's a very unique system of unique is one of the first legal systems, period. It is the first universal legal system. Okay, so I hope this helped. If you have any questions, feel free to email me, and I will speak with you guys later.